Terrific paper, Jenn and Jason, and I'm especially interested in it because there's a very analogous problem with the Fifth Amendment due process of law clause and the 14th Amendment due process of law clause. So just a quick thing, there's an uncontroversial way for originalists in which prior provisions are relevant. They can be part of the public context of constitutional communication, and so they could disambiguate or contribute to some kind of pragmatic enrichment. But here's what I think is the really interesting problem on the interpretation side, right? So we've got two constitutions, Constitution 1 and Constitution 2. To make it simple, they both have an identically worded clause. And now there are four possible communicative intentions, right? So first, there can be, with respect to Constitution 2. So first, there can be an intention to convey some content, some proposition P. That's a first order communicative intention, right? We want clause A to mean P. That's what we're trying to get across. Second, there could be a second order communicative intention to convey the same content as clause A conveyed to the public at the time Constitution number 1 was framed and ratified. Third intention, there can be an intention to convey the same content as judges have assigned to clause A in Constitution 1 as of the endpoint of Constitution 1, at the endpoint of the chain of judicial decisions. And number 4, there could be a second order intention to convey the original public meaning of clause A in Constitution number 2 at the time Constitution number 2 is framed and ratified. So now there's a happy story and then there's a tragic story. So the happy story is that the four communicative intentions are identical or that they overlap to such a degree that the differences are minor and of neither great political significance to ratification nor legal significance to construction. That's the happy story. Identity or very substantial overlap. But of course there's a tragic story, and this is what's so interesting about your paper is the tragic story, right? So here's the worst case scenario, right? There are really substantial differences between all four intentions. That is, the first order communicative intention number 1 results in substantially different content than 2, which results in substantially different content than 1, 3, and 4, and so on. They're all different, right? So under those circumstances, then there's a question, what should we say the Constitution means? Right? And from the point of view of public meaning originalism, right? Just this is my instinct. From the point of view of public meaning originalism, I think number 4 is the controlling intention, right? That is, all those intentions can be present and they can conflict with each other. But at the end of the day, you go with public meaning, right? But on the other hand, original methods originalism might, Mike and John can speak for themselves, right? They might lead to number 3, right? And so I think that there are just a host of really intriguing issues here. And so I'm just wondering what you think about this question of what we do with 4 conflicting first and then second order communicative intentions.
Okay. Yeah. So I really like this paper. It's hard to find some new area to write about, and for it to be enlightening in this way, and I think you did that. And I look forward to the full version of it. I figured I was number 2 on the queue, but you know, being behind Jack and Larry, you know, a lot of what I said, what I was planning on saying, they said. I still think there's a little bit here, but it's so I guess the first point I wanted to talk about is if we're talking about the intra-constitutional issue, then under original methods, if in fact these were sort of accepted methods, then that would be the meaning. You know, people would have known that. Now, I guess there's issues about what the methods actually were, but to the extent that those are accepted methods, that would be the meaning of things. It would have to, so especially if at the time of the 14th Amendment, if that was an accepted method, that would be, at least that's my view of it. Secondly, I was going to make the point that sort of Jack pointed out, which is that, you know, you can use these different interpretive rules that you have here, very interestingly explicates some of the disagreements people have about the content of the Incorporated Bill of Rights, right? You've got the view of some people. I actually, some years ago, Mike Paulson gave this view at the Originalism Conference, which is that it doesn't matter what the interpretation was in 1850 or whatever it was. It's the original meaning of the original Bill of Rights that's the law. That sort of follows from the first of your rules, and then of course the Keeler-Moore view, which takes the meaning either to some extent as judicially interpreted, and to some extent what is prevalent at the time, but judicially interpreted, and so on. So one suggestion is you might have sort of 2 papers here. Actually, it seems to me you might have 2 audiences. You could sort of take the you know, there are sort of examples that you give from the state constitutional law, and that seems to me that's sort of an article on interconstitutional. It's the article that you've written now, but then you could have a sort of separate article, it's not really about interconstitutionalism, but intra-constitutionalism, which explores all these examples from the U.S. Constitution and connects them up with different theories that people have. And I think there'd be a different audience for that, and you'd want to have you know, talk about different things. But I think that would be a really sort of fascinating second article to do here.
This is fascinating, and it seems to me that a large part of the problem or the puzzle that you're analyzing in the paper arises from the fact that you've got text in a constitution that is identical or similar to text in a prior constitution. And you know, what is the relationship between those two? And I take it the reason that happens is that if people want to engage in constitutional change in a state, they have a choice between 2 procedural routes. They can adopt discrete amendments to the Constitution, where I guess you'd expect most or all of the language to be new, such that your problem would not arise, or it would not arise as commonly or as acutely. Or the second procedural route is that they replace the Constitution completely, but they don't write 100% new language. They repeat some of the language from the prior Constitution, and hence your problem arises in the most acute way. And so I'm wondering, do you have an account of how or why that choice is made in state constitutional change between discrete amendments, maybe serial or several discrete amendments on the one hand versus wholesale replacement on the other hand. I'm assuming the account would have to do with varying. The account would have to do with the relative procedural difficulty of doing those two things within each of the states, and then I think even more interestingly the politics. I mean, do we have an account, maybe in the poli-sci literature or the state con law legal literature, of what's going on politically when you're getting discrete amendments, what's going on politically when you're getting wholesale replacements? Sometimes it just seems from the dates of the constitutions that this must be the Reconstruction Constitution, this must be the Redeemer Constitution, but there seem to be lots of other replacements that don't have an obvious historical pedigree from the date. And if you can give more of a political account of that, it might enrich the state constitutional analysis in the way that the Hungarian analysis is already very politically enriched.
Great, thank you all so much. These are wonderful comments. Let me just jump in, and then Jem can jump in as well. Larry, the sort of the four categories is immensely helpful, and I think it will be a useful way for us to sort of work through some of these examples and add some more theoretical heft to all of this. In terms of your question, which of the four, I'm actually with you, or I would have been at least before I started seeing all of these cases, that it's number four. That its original public meaning, as of the time the provision is ratified. I would take that view with respect to state constitutions, with the federal constitution. My friend Kurt Lash, I can see, is on the screen. He has a new paper out on re-speaking the Bill of Rights that makes this point. And of course, I'm a student of Akil Amar and Steve Calabresi, who also take this view. The one downside, or maybe a couple of downsides to this, but one downside that the state courts have identified for not following that approach is they think it's too disruptive. So they often justify their reliance upon one of these other categories in terms of the stability of the law, and so that sort of is built into their notion of what is the constitution of our state. Is not just the document that has been newly ratified, but that this old thing must still hang around in some way, because otherwise there's just too much disruption. I think my own sense is that that's not terribly persuasive. But the state courts that engage in interconstitutionalism defend this position strongly. A couple of other things, Mike, I like your idea of sort of getting us to focus on implications for the Bill of Rights, where of course there is this sort of comparable question about interpreting, and Larry had mentioned this also, interpreting provisions of the Bill of Rights at the moment of incorporation. The one thing that I think the project raises, and this goes also to Nick's question, is what does it mean to actually amend a constitution versus to replace a constitution? Mike's comments go to that, sort of how transformative is the 14th Amendment with respect to the early provisions of the Bill of Rights, styled as amendments, right, rather than, of course, starting from scratch. So one would imagine there has to be some degree of harmony. Nonetheless, there is considerable evidence. Judd Campbell and others, Mikhail Amar, have shown that meanings of these provisions were different in 1868 compared to 1791. And so that sort of piece of it, the distinction between amending versus replacing, which is something that Nick asks us to focus on. One of the things on Jem's to-do list is to identify the political science literature on why states choose to amend rather than replace. My own sense is that aside from sort of the political constraints, there are a variety of explanations, or there are a variety of reasons why a state might add a new constitution rather than just amend the existing constitution. One might be, and this may have implications also for Larry's 4 categories. One reason, we see this in some states, is just to clean up a constitution that has been amended multiple times already. And so, you know, the whole purpose of the new constitution is to arrange things where they really ought to be and give us a new clean document. So if that's the, you know, if that's the purpose and the goal of the new constitution, then it seems to me much less transformative than other instances where you are making a break from an earlier constitution. So at the state level, you might contrast that with, say, the Reconstruction era constitutions that come out of the South that the Southern Confederate states are required to adopt. They're not cleaning up. Those are transformative. And outside of the United States, many more examples of transformation as the reason for the new constitution, a wholesale repudiation of the prior regime because of revolution or war or other sorts of dramatic changes. And yet, even there, when you get a new constitution in place, they're sometimes treated as just sort of amending the prior constitution so that some of that stuff from the prior constitution continues to lurk around and influence meaning. So Nick's comment about this sort of question between amendment versus replacement is an important one. But I think that the study that we've been doing suggests that actually conceptually these things are not all that clean. Oh, Jen,
Right.
I'm sorry.
No worries. Just to add to that real quick, the comparative examples that Jason mentioned, Tom Ginsburg did an empirical study on this, and they found the average lifespan of a constitution on average to be 19 years. And they said it was akin to the life of a well-groomed house cat. And that tells, it would be interesting to compare that with the average lifespan of a state constitution in the United States, perhaps. But I do agree with Jason that there might be more mundane reasons for replacing a constitution. But I do share the sentiment that, of course, Reconstruction and then procedural reasons might have had an impact as well. That is the ease with which state constitutions can be replaced. And so that, I think, gets me to Larry's question, and perhaps to assuage some of the concerns around a tragic scenario that he described. Given that state constitutional replacement with respect to states occurs under less drastic circumstances when compared to other comparative examples, Latin America comes to mind. It might, the sense of rupture then, I think, is lessened in state cases, which then leads me to speculate. Perhaps there is enough reason then to believe that the 4 sort of permutations that you mentioned will be, judges will be inclined to interpret those 4 agreeably, especially because the rupture isn't as acute as it is in comparative sort of examples. And that's why the degree of continuity, including judicial interpretive continuity, is then much more established in states even after replacement. And hence, interpreters at the state level, I think one could speculate with some comfort, will be inclined to interpret the 4 different permutations coherently. And so that's my case against the tragic scenario in a nutshell.
Okay, our next 3 are Julian Mortensen, Richard Epstein, and Tom Colby.
Hey guys, I love this paper. It's detailed, interesting, takes a spin that I haven't thought about, and throws off all kinds of interesting theoretical implications. 2 quick thoughts. The first is a literature to compare, which is to say, or which is to reference, the discussion is both in judicial opinions and also in the scholarship on statutory ratification of agency interpretations. There's, I think, probably some interesting theoretical stuff there to play with. And I think especially there's some interesting empirical challenges to some of the assumptions that underlie what's going on in that realm that might sort of bear on your questions here. It's also neat possibly because often, not always, but often the questions presented there are sort of smaller bore at some level lower stakes, such that they don't get swamped by the normative impulses that often are brought to bear on constitutional interpretation. So that's just a suggestion, probably not for this paper, but if you pursue, if and as you pursue the project. For this paper, one thing that jumped out to me was a possible reframing, not of the whole paper, but of one piece of it, which is to say, this strikes me as a subset of a larger principle. I mean, I guess this is like a splitting versus lumping suggestion, and you always have to figure out where to come down on that, but at least adverting to this possible lumping move. This seems like a subset of a larger interpretive principle, which is that salient texts at the time that a constitution is written ought to be given special consideration and or possibly like operate as determinative of the meaning of one provision or of a phrase and so on. And the point here is that salient texts can be not in the lineage in the sense that you guys describe it in your interconstitutional interpretation rubric, the first among the various approaches that you describe. It doesn't have to be in the lineage, much less in a formal constitutional lineage, with the document that's being drafted to present exactly this kind of question. And one thing that jumps out to me as I was trying to think of examples was, you know, the states that, and countries, I mean, the countries that in the wake of, well, World War II, but not only World War II, adopt constitutions that draw heavily on US models. Like there's no sense in which the US model is in significant, I don't know, lineage relationship with them. But you could easily see exactly this kind of move being made. Also strikes me that you see this all the time in treaty interpretation, where sometimes a previous treaty, which really maps on directly what you're talking about, previous treaty between the parties, and it gets really interesting when you talk about multilateral treaties. But then also sometimes just like a couple of really salient treaties like those guys have, and we're going to do that, right? And so this idea of salience, there's special reasons on a spectrum of salience that the existence of some salient text in your own tradition would be especially salient. But it just strikes me at some level that there's a missing piece in your taxonomy, which is to say like the idea of salient texts and this being a subset of that. And it might suggest some interesting further comparators as you, if and as you pursue this in other areas. It's a great paper and a great project.
Hello. Hi, Jason. You know, I'm going to do the cowardly thing saying, here you've done the most exhaustive work possible, but now here's some other things for you to think about. But let me mention, I think this problem of transmission is actually a good deal more difficult than a simple question of interpretation independent of institutions. And let me give you a couple of transitions that took place and ask you the ways in which you would want to think about them. The first one is, there is a statute in New York which says the common law of this state shall be the common law of England as of July 2nd, 1775 or 6, right? This is an explicit adoption. It explains why the American Revolution is not the same. What is included? Was the statute quietum Torres included? Was it not? And then something you don't talk about is these two bodies of law continue to go side by side, right? For the next 100 years. Can you start looking at the one and start seeing the extent to which it influences the other and how that takes place? That question, by the way, is heavily dependent on the world before and the world after Erie v. Tompkins, because the parallelism was much stronger in the one case than in the other. And I don't think you could figure out what's going on unless you do that. Our second illustration is the patent provisions that we're talking about. And what happens is we have a clause in ours which talks about patents, about, you know, for the useful arts and so forth. A lot of this carries over from English practice, but it's designed to repudiate it, to give you a much narrower interpretation than so forth. So when you start seeing incorporations about this, it seems to me you really have to be able to do that. This became extremely important in the oil states case, where there were huge numbers of arguments made back to earlier practice, many by Mark Lemlin, all of which turned out to be wrong, I think, relative to somebody like Thomas, I can never remember his last name, from Lewis and Clark, who knows everything and everything about English equity practice in the 13th, 14th, 16th century and so forth. And if you don't know the equity practice, I don't think it could carry over. The third illustration is the Bill of Rights. You know, the English Bill of Rights is not a law. It's a bill. And it has things like excessive fines. It has privileges, cruel and unusual punishments with an S at the end of it, as in the American Constitution, or dropped off. Is it possible that they could be construed in the same way when one of them is mysteriously more than precatory but less than enforceable, and the other, only after we decide to adopt essentially the system of judicial review, becomes binding but may not have been binding before that? The Bill of Rights, they choose that term for a reason. Well, that interpretation, I think everything that goes on in England becomes irrelevant to everything that goes on in the United States. And so I think in effect that just doing this textually without being aware of a lot of these institutional complications, and I could give you other examples, you're going to find that it's going to be harder to do it. This is not an argument for either tragic or comical kinds of conclusions, but it is an observation that generalization in this area is something which I think is very, very dangerous. So, okay, that's for you and Tashem. I'll be done.
Okay, great paper, really tremendously interesting topic. I guess my question, the answers to my question have sort of been coming out in fits and spurts in the commentary and in the questions and answers, but I didn't see them addressed so clearly in the paper. So I think it's worth kind of confronting them more aggressively. And the question is, what, if any, unique interpretive work is being done by the fact that the earlier document is a constitution, and in particular, a constitution of the same sovereign? Because much of what we do in textual interpretation is we look for historical antecedents of a phrase, we try to figure out what the meaning of that phrase was in the earlier documents, and then we try to consider from context whether the current document is intended to co-opt those meanings or perhaps maybe to depart from them. You know, like for instance, what Larry and Max did with regard to due process of law in their paper. They're looking at state constitutions, English rights declarations, things like that, and the same phrase and trying to figure out, does it have the same meaning or a different meaning, and giving content to that meaning through earlier documents. We do that all the time in statutory interpretation as well. So concretely, I guess, are the interpretive rules and practices that you identify in your paper, are they any different when we're looking at the Articles of Confederation than when we're looking at the English Bill of Rights or Magna Carta or the New York State Constitution? And if so, how are they different? What's the theory? What's the practice of that? I think spelling that out, you know, is kind of going a lot to what Julian was saying, would be helpful.
Okay, great. Thank you for all of these. Richard, I think my response to you is thank you. We have more work to do, and you can look forward to a revised draft in your inbox shortly. This sort of institutional piece of it, I think, is very important. You're right that we are focused very much on text and court decisions, and without the sort of broader attention that you are suggesting. And the examples that you gave are ones that we will track down. So I just thank you for that. Because Julian and Tom and both sort of are asking questions within sort of the world in which we're working, I can respond to them in a little more detail. And I guess, I mean, if I start with the questions that they're both asking is somewhat similar. Tom asks about, of course, in other contexts, we use historical antecedents of prior documents. We ask about, you know, the relevance of those in interpreting contemporary provisions and so on. I think that you're right in that there is that aspect going on in the sort of interconstitutional practices that we are describing, but with a significant difference that we try to highlight in the case in the paper, and that we have sort of more examples of for sort of future versions, and that is that when it comes to use of prior constitutions, especially by the state courts, it's not just that these early constitutions are of relevance, but that they might actually, and state courts may construe them as continuing to bind. And so I think that takes the practice that makes the practice a little bit different from sort of reliance upon prior sources, even sources that are of great significance, the use of the Declaration of Independence, so on. I mean, the state courts are saying that absent some evidence to the contrary, we're going to assign to the meaning of Constitution 2, the meaning of the same provision under Constitution 1, and that has implications for how we're going to decide the case. We're going to decide the case as though Constitution 1 was still in effect. So I do think that this is a practice where these prior constitutions are playing an outcome determinative role in a sense that isn't true with respect to other sources that may be of relevance and may help you get to your interpretation of the present constitutional provision. That takes me then to Julian's very helpful comments about sort of thinking about salient text and so on. So here's the thing that I worry about in this area of interconstitutional practice, and that is that the way that the courts that follow this approach, and many of these state courts do, everything starts to become salient. Everything starts to have a historical pedigree. Everything seems to have a kind of legalistic meaning, so that if you repeat the word, you're stuck with all of that because there's case law that's been built up around the provision, and we're just going to assume that you've ratified all of that. In other words, the ability to sort of escape the overhang of the prior constitution, we think is fairly minimal because of the way in which the courts are attributing prior meaning and matching prior meaning onto the prior line of cases. There are very few instances in which you can just ask about, what is ordinary public meaning at the time Constitution 2 is ratified. The courts, when they ask that, are sort of bringing in all of the pre-existing baggage with respect to every single provision that they're interpreting. And so that sort of distinction between salient or non-salient provisions, or distinctions between technical legal provisions and more ordinary provisions, all of those things are getting collapsed or driven out of the process in a way that makes it very hard for somebody who's writing a new constitution to put on page, or ratifying a new constitution, to put on page what it is that they want to do. It's a little bit like, I used to work in intellectual property law. At some point you start running out of trademarks that you can use because they all have a prior meaning and they point to some other product. That is in essence what is happening with these sort of multiple constitutions over time, and the significance that the courts are attributing to their meaning. Now, maybe there are some at some point you run out of trademarks. At some point you run out of constitutional terms that you can use, and once you start repeating, you're stuck.
Can I quickly add to what Jason said, and to complicate the picture somewhat further, and to take the example of Georgia? The current Georgian Constitution has a provision, I believe, at the very end of the document saying all previous constitutions and amendments to those constitutions are hereby repealed, or something like that. Then the question is, of course, if we engage in interconstitutional interpretation and sort of revive all these past Georgian constitutions, or some of them, then what purpose does that abrogation clause serve? And about text and context and doing more excavation, I think the point raised by Professor Epstein, with which I agree. I just say that reminds me, the New York statute example reminds me that interconstitutional interpretation sometimes can be a textual mandate. In fact, the German Basic Law, for example, expressly references the Weimar Constitution of 1919 with respect to the German Basic Law's provisions on religious freedom. So in that case, of course, the question then arises, would that be interconstitutional interpretation if interpreters of the German Basic Law reference the Weimar Constitution, or would they be operating within the confines of of the current German basic law. But I think that's something to consider as well. Meaning text, of course, without that excavation, that work that you rightly point out, is of course incomplete. But text itself, I guess, does have some agency, as the German example somewhat illustrates.
So I really enjoyed this paper, and my questions might intersect significantly with some of the things previously asked. But I mean, you mentioned in your paper specifically ideas about dealing with changes in grammar, changes in omission. How would one deal with a more significant phenomenon of context, or even just a change in structure of the government? So if we're moving from Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, how does one account for the fact that there are now all of a sudden 3 branches? And so therefore, even references to phrases that are wholesale brought into the new Constitution might mean something totally different. And then is there a reason to not apply the same methodology to importing a phrase from moving from the state level to the federal level, then moving from the Articles of Confederation to the US Constitution? Or would you do the same methodology, for since the federal Constitution is coming from a group of states forming together? Is there a similar justification when we're looking at articles, the whole body, to the US Constitution, as opposed to moving from a phrase that might have been in 1 or 2 state constitutions to the larger Constitution? And then I guess the last thing is tied to the context and structure question, the first one that I asked. Does there also have to be evidence that the same interpretive methodology was used in the earlier Constitution for one to just wholesale bring all the precedent along with it?
Jason and Jem, thanks for this very interesting paper. I wanted to see if I could put your paper in conversation with Dick Fallon's paper from yesterday. I was on the queue and didn't get a chance to ask him my question. So with your permission, I'm going to kind of distill the gist of that in a way that will invite you to comment. It seems to me that if he is right in his ontologically skeptical thesis about the original public meaning of the Constitution, or that there's no fact of the matter about that, then the practices that you're describing are doubly problematic, or even more problematic. We would be investigating the relationship between 2 non-existing things in some respect, and going from the frying pan to the fire. On the other hand, it might be that the practices that you're describing call into question his thesis. And I'm fascinated by the idea that there are 160 some cases in which the Supreme Court is drawing upon the Articles of Confederation to interpret the Constitution. That's really interesting. And one might think that it's precisely because that effort in historically investigating the Articles is deemed not so problematic and doesn't raise the same kinds of anxieties that we always encounter with original public meaning of the Constitution, that maybe the skeptical thesis that Dick was arguing needs to be reframed or is problematic in some way. And I think this generalizes. I mean, the question I was going to ask him was, doesn't this generalize to all founding era legal documents, precisely because we can ascertain the original meaning of the Articles or of the 1798, tax acts that Nick described for us yesterday, or any one of a number of legal documents that have many of the features that were troubling him. So multi-member bodies, collective intentions, a highly politicized process, and so forth, and lots of contestation all the way through. It's all present. But you're finding for us a practice where we have a relationship between 2 things, and I guess there's 3 possibilities. One could be very skeptical about both the prior Constitution and the current Constitution, the meanings of them, I guess I should say. One could be skeptical about neither, or the skepticism could only arise with respect to the current Constitution. So that's where the anxieties about original public meaning set in. And if that's the case, I wonder if it tells us something about the distinction between interpretation and adjudication, that it's really only because the current Constitution is legal authority and we have to do different things with it than merely interpret it, that we maybe see what we see in terms of the relation between the prior Constitution and the current one. So that's just all by way of inviting you to maybe juxtapose your paper with Dick's and maybe comment on whether you think there's a relationship there worth discussing.
Yes, I enjoyed this paper very much. So here are just two thoughts. One is it's sort of an empirical question. How is one sure about the dogs that didn't bark? In other words, the large range of cases where there were provisions, but they're not cited, that they're ignored. Obviously, it's easier to find if they self-consciously reject them, but if in most cases they don't actually, how strong is the rule? This is, I think, a very hard question for deciding whether there actually is a rule. And I don't know whether you have a methodological strategy for that. Then I just want to follow up on Tom Colby's issue, which I think is very strong, is that there's a lot of this, and I'd add one example, is even constitutions from which you've broken away have influence. The British Constitution is often used as a template for understanding the American Constitution and executive legislative authority. And that leads me, I guess, to my final point, which is, what's the strength of the rule? So certainly with that context, you might say, well, that's a presumption. We presume that it's the executive power, but we have to look at the different history. We have to look at the rest of the Constitution. And that's true of a lot of, I don't want to denigrate that. That's true of a lot of our interpretive rules. There are rules that are presumptions. Then you might say, well, sometimes there's stronger presumptions. Maybe there's stronger presumptions when it's the exact same wording with the Constitution than when it's just the general structure of the British Constitution vis-a-vis our Constitution. But those are as another thing that I might think you might want to explore.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Great set of comments. I want to make sure that Jem gets to engage with Professor Fallon's paper, since he's a former student of Professor Fallon's. And so that seems like a nice kind of intergenerational benefit. But let me, John, thanks so much for your thought. You're absolutely right that sort of finding the instances where this doesn't happen, maybe many more cases perhaps than where it does. We do have a plan that we're sort of working out to track, to pull out from prior constitutions provisions that reappear in a later constitution, but in a way that would identify interpretations that make no reference to the earlier reference. And so that's a sort of future phase of the project that I think will tease out at least some of the cases. And you're quite right, there might be a huge number of them. The strength of the rule piece is very interesting, and I don't think that from the state court decisions that we've seen so far, they've really explained very clearly the scope of the strength of the presumption that they apply. There is discussion in some of the state cases that we apply a very strong presumption, and then a sort of a footnote saying we don't at this point explain how this interacts with general rules of stare decisis. So they are leaving a little bit of space for possibly just a kind of same rule of stare decisis or something stronger. The Georgia Supreme Court seems to be doing that. Jen, you asked great questions as sort of maybe changes in the whole structure from Constitution 1 to Constitution 2, and how does that matter? I'll have to look more closely if we have examples of that, but certainly in terms of allocations of power, we have a series of cases where courts are understanding under Constitution 2 that there is, if a power was exercised without question under Constitution 1 by one branch of government, but is not mentioned anywhere in Constitution Constitution 2, we're going to assume that under Constitution 2, that branch of government, rather than some other, has the same power. So at least in terms of sort of allocations of authority, the courts are attending to this. In terms of, sort of basic reworking or of basic structures of the documents, I will have to make a note and see whether we have examples of that. You also ask about the sort of state versus US comparison, and with which we're all very familiar. There is an aspect to interconstitutionalism that is extremely parochial in the sense that it's all sort of internal to the state. And the state courts that are doing this will go out of their way to say, we don't care that every other state understands this provision or did understand this provision differently today. They're resisting this kind of relevance of practices or interpretations in other states with respect to identical provisions. And they're also resisting what your question also suggested, constructions by the US Supreme Court of provisions that are based, at least in part, on understandings of what state constitutional provisions that say the same thing mean. They're really carving out this, as I said, kind of parochial area of constitutional interpretation, a lineage for Georgia, and this sort of strong sense of identity for our state as a constitutional matter. That strikes us as just a kind of really interesting piece of these practices. These are not courts that are interested in being cosmopolitan or part of sort of a general constitutional conversation. They want to think about themselves as having for their state a distinct constitutional lineage that goes back in time rather than has any sort of particular relevance to what's happening elsewhere. I'll let Jim answer John's really interesting question and invitation to sort of engage with Dick Fallon's paper. I'll just say one quick thing, and it goes back to something I said a little bit earlier, that the effect of all of this is to increasingly impose legal technical meaning on words that you might have thought were sort of open to sort of public meaning. And so in that sense, maybe what the states are doing, I'd have to think through this a bit more, maybe what the state practices are doing is to reduce perhaps that sense of disagreement or inability to settle on shared original public meaning, because the state courts at least say, no, there is a single meaning, it's ours. But that has implications, right, of course, for constitution making as well. Jim.
I just want to respond first to the strength of the rule point that I think is really incisive. And I think it partly depends on how easily one can rebut the presumption of the rule, that the presumption of constitutional continuity. And so the cases that I looked at, the burden on the part of the new framers to repudiate the past constitutional order isn't really clear, although courts will at times refer to, as I said, convention debates and cite even individual people involved in the drafting of the new constitution, especially if they've said something along the lines of, we want this provision to be carried over into this new constitution. But to me, that the means through which the presumption can be rebutted are ambiguous might in fact strengthen the rule, in that ambiguity might then be used by sympathetic judges who want to establish that constitutional continuity narrative, especially in states, would then use that ambiguity to suggest that the rule withstands and that it hasn't been rebutted. But on balance, it's ambiguous. And about the Articles of Confederation and relatedly, whether or not the problem in Professor Fallon's article that he identified as sort of compounded in interconstitutional interpretation, given that there are two sort of public original meanings, and it's not clear if they are compatible with one another. And and whether they exist in the first place. I'll say one thing about the articles, and I think it partly responds to that question as well. The right word might be, in many instances, mention instead of interpretation, or any sort of powerful invocation, at least in the case of the articles, because in most of the cases that I looked at, and Jason is aware of many, if not all of them as well, the invocation is very casual. Sometimes it is very unclear as to what contribution the invocation of the articles makes to the resolution of the actual case. And you get the sense from the prefacing statements that the justices use just before invoking the articles. We must look to context, et cetera, the standard sort of sentences. So in that sense, maybe to suggest that the articles in the 169 cases that we've identified, they have been used forcefully might be an overstatement. So in that case, maybe there is an argument to be made that interconstitutional interpretation, as it happens at the federal level, is a bit of an overstatement when it comes to using the articles. And I wonder whether that argument holds true at the state level, perhaps not as forcefully, but there is an argument to be made again that invocations of past constitutions before state courts are, again, not very much pointed and don't contribute really to the resolution of the constitutional question before the court. And in that sense, in that sense, then the second public original meaning factor that complicates the picture and maybe adds on to the problems Professor Fallon has identified in his paper is maybe less severe than one might think at first blush.